Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christopher Shasi, and I'm going to bring you through an MDM migration workflow that we set up for migrating from one MDM server over to Jamf Pro. Today we're going to cover the challenges of MDM migrations, the confusion that this creates for the users, and then a workflow that we've created that addresses all of this. So first off, how did MDM migrations used to work before we had all these challenges? Dare I say that it was easy back in the day. So it used to be that step one, we would just deploy the Jamf quick add package through the previous MDM. That would install the Jamf agent on the computer. And then we would send a command through Jamf to remove the previous MDM profile and then install the Jamf MDM profile. And then in typical Apple fashion, there was no step 3. But those days are now over unless all your computers are on Sierra or below, which hopefully they're not. So what are the challenges that we have today with some of the changes that Apple's made in automating this process? Well, first of all, we can only install one MDM profile at a time. There are also non-removable MDM profiles that cannot be removed by either a bash script or the user. On top of this, when we do remove that profile, all the configuration profiles are removed along with the MDM profile. Once we do get it migrated over, those file vault recovery keys break, so we need to reissue those. And then since High Sierra, Apple introduced user-approved MDM profiles, which require user interaction. And then since Big Sur, they took away the ability to programmatically install MDM profiles altogether. And then along with all of this, the web enrollment process since High Sierra has gotten a lot more complicated when enrolling in Jamf Pro. So let's look at each of these individually. First of all, the MDM profile must be user approved. So even if we just install it programmatically with High Sierra through Catalina, the user needs to go into the system profiles or system preferences profile pane in order to approve that MDM profile. And until that time, they have limited functionality. And then since Big Sur, like I said, they took away the ability to install it programmatically altogether. Only one MDM profile can be installed at a time. This actually creates a big issue when we're trying to do these migrations, because oftentimes the user will go through the process of installing the profile, and then they'll get this error: profile installation failed. You are already enrolled in an MDM server. It's actually kind of confusing for the user to remove that MDM profile via the GUI. They need to find the actual MDM profile, and if you have a big list of configuration profiles, that's going to be hard to do. Also, if the previous profile is in DEP, it can't be removed for the user. Which brings me to my next point. Those non-removable MDM profiles can't be removed by the user, can't be removed by any bash commands or any other type of commands. It can only be removed via the previous MDM. Now let's say that the previous MDM is no longer active or not able to communicate with the device. What do we need to do then? Well, the user needs to boot into the recovery mode, remove SIP, which is a couple terminal commands, boot back into the boot disk, remove the MDM profile, and then we need to boot back into recovery mode, enable SIP, because that is an important security feature, and then boot back into the boot disk. So not a process we want to go through. And along with this, once that MDM profile is removed, especially this is a big problem if we're removing it programmatically, because there's often a gap between removing the old one and installing the new one, which will install the new configuration profiles. All those profiles are going to be removed, which means the user might be disconnected from Wi-Fi, important configurations may be removed, applications may not be able to run, and then the user will get all these pop-ups for system extensions and PPPC profiles, which can be really weird for the user. And this is going to make them probably call the help desk and say, hey, I don't know what's happening, but someone seems like they're trying to hack into my computer because all this stuff is popping up out of nowhere. On top of all of this, there's also the difficulties of web enrollment since 10.13.4. So at that point, we went from enrolling through a quick add package, which was pretty simple for a user. It was just running a package, to now installing a CA certificate and an MDM profile, which was a little more confusing because it was 2 different steps. Also, since Big Sur, once you download that profile and launch it, which happens automatically in Safari, the user needs to manually open up System Preferences and navigate to the Profiles pane. These might sound like small things, but as I've gone through a lot of these different migrations and implementations, users, it doesn't matter what you give them for instructions, users are just confused about this process. Also, in order to enroll into Jamf Pro, you need to be an admin on your computer. So if the user's standard, well, now you either need to give the user a backdoor admin password, or you need to do it for the user. So I want to show you what all of this looks like when we put it together from a user perspective. So you might have a list of instructions for the user to go through. First of all, you tell them to navigate to your instance name .jamfcloud.com/enroll in order to enroll. This is where we encounter the first problem. You need to put HTTPS at the beginning of that URL or it's not going to work. So then they go ahead and they put HTTPS:// in front of that URL. And now they get to this login page. Now, if you don't have LDAP or an IDP set up, the user is going to be confused at how to log in here. So a lot of times IT admins will just give them enroll as a username and password, which isn't super secure. But then they get to this screen that says assign to user, where again, the user's a little bit confused at what to do. So they just go ahead and click enroll. Now they get to the first step where they download the CA certificate. So they go ahead, download it, click allow. And then they get this little pop-up. And once they click on it, it just goes away. It doesn't actually launch System Preferences. So now they have to launch System Preferences, go to the Profiles area, and then click Install. And now they need to do the same thing for the MDM profile. And I see people confused by this step over and over again, especially because once they get to this step, we've got this little wheel that turns around, which makes it seem like something's installing. But actually what it's doing is it's waiting for the user to go back, open up System Preferences, go to the Profiles area, and then go and install that profile. So finally they learn that they need to do that. However, in this process, if the old MDM profile is in place, they just this command that says profile installation has failed. In this particular example, this is a non-removable profile. So if they call the help desk just has to say, hey, yeah, we need to remove that on our end. We're going to escalate this to someone who can remove that MDM profile. So at this point, the user goes back to work, starts doing the important work that they always do every day, and they're waiting for that MDM profile to be removed. Now at this moment, they might start to see some pop-ups as that MDM profile is removed. The VPN server starts disconnecting and reconnecting. They get a weird pop-up for McAfee system extensions and content filter. They get notifications from Nomad. They're a little confused what's happening. Also, their internet's getting disconnected because their VPN's having to refresh and they're not able to watch these amazing videos that are very important for their work. So now they call the help desk and they wonder what's happening and they let them know, hey, you're good to enroll now. So go back to that URL, go through the same process you went through before and install these profiles. So I'm sure a lot of you are looking at this and saying, well, there's 20 different ways you could do this to make it easier. And there just definitely is. If the devices are in DEP in the new server, you could have them run the profiles renew -type enrollment in order to go through the DEP process. You could also have them, you could give them an enrollment invitation so they don't have to log in. You can also have them log in with their identity provider. But all these things, if they're on an earlier version too, they don't have all these complications like on High Sierra and Mojave and Catalina. However, this brings up another point where we're working with a bunch of different scenarios with a bunch of different workflows. So it's hard to even give the users correct instructions on how to do this because you almost need to give them 10 sets of instructions depending on how their computers are set up. Oftentimes too, if we're migrating from one MDM to another, there's a really good reason why we're migrating. And usually it's because things are a mess. So we have Macs that are in DEP, some that aren't. We have some Macs that have non-removable MDM profiles, some that don't. We have some that don't have any MDM profile in the old MDM, but they're still enrolled in the old MDM. They just never had that MDM profile. Some also aren't active in the old MDM. So they might have been enrolled and have the MDM profile, but we can't even communicate them for one reason or another. And then there's even some computers that never got enrolled in the old MDM at all at any point. So they're just not enrolled in anything. And then we have, people that are in operating systems since that last 4 years and haven't upgraded since then. So we're getting a bunch of different stuff from that angle. So there is, so for someone who's gone through these types of migrations, a lot of times there is a lot to take into account as we're going through this. And trying to do this all manually without having a workflow in the back end can be very cumbersome. So let's talk a little bit about the migration that we put together and how it works. So first of all, what are we doing in the back end? Well, on the original MDM server, let's say we're using something like WorkspaceONE, we're going to deploy that Jamf quick add package through the old MDM. We can also do that through a script as well, if for some reason they don't have a distribution point set up. Then we're going to deploy the necessary PPPC profiles that we need in order for Jamf to use this migration workflow through the old MDM. So there's a lot of cool stuff we can do if we get access to the user's desktop documents and downloads folder. And then also giving us access to typical Apple script type stuff so we can interact with those windows in cool ways. We're then going to deploy dep notify and any necessary assets. We can actually do that through Jamf or the old MDM, whichever we choose. And then lastly, we're going to run this migration script through Jamf that we're going to show you. I have put together a flowchart that I thought would simplify what this process looks like in the back end. And then after I put it together, I thought, this looks nothing like simple. So I'm going to walk you through this and hopefully this will start to make a little bit of sense. So back end, we're installing all those things that I said, and then we're deploying this script, which has a lot of if statements to go through different scenarios that we're going to encounter. So the first scenario the first question we need to ask is this Mac enrolled in Jamf? And by that, I mean, does it have the Jamf MDM profile? If it does, we're going to skip this whole migration workflow. The reason this might happen is someone, while we're doing this migration workflow, might enroll the computer manually because they're not part of any MDM, so we can't deploy that quick add package. So in that case, we're just going to skip this entire workflow down here and just go straight to the steps we're doing after we're migrated. Then the next thing we're going to ask is this assigned to a Jamf pre-stage? If it is, we can go through the slick DEP workflow that also makes the device supervised. If it's not a Jamf pre-stage, then we're going to have to go through the non-DEP workflow. Let's talk about what that looks like. So first off, we're going to deploy user instructions through dep notify. If necessary, if the user is a standard user, we're going to promote them to admin. We're then going to directly open the enrollment page through Safari, and this is a page where they don't have to log in. It'll just open directly to the download link for the MDM profile. Then we need to ask another question in this script. Is the old MDM profile present? So this is something we encounter sometimes where it's enrolled in WorkspaceONE, but it never actually got the MDM profile for some reason. So we're able to deploy the quick add package, but once we get to this step, we need to do a different workflow. Because we weren't able to deploy the slick PPPC profiles that allows us to do a lot of cool stuff that I'll show you in a second. So instead, we're going to, through dep notify, display some manual enrollment instructions to aid them through that process of going back and forward a bunch of times. And then we wait for the user to install the MDM profile. before moving on to the next steps. However, if that old MDM profile is present, then we're going to wait for the user to download the MDM profile from the page where they click download. We're then going to launch that MDM profile, remove at this point the old MDM profile through a command. We can either do this through a profiles command, or we can do an API call through the old MDM if it's a non-removable profile. Then we're going to launch system preferences and wait for the user to install the MDM profile. Once they have installed, we move on to the next step. Let's say it's in DEP. What are we going to do at this point? We're going to deploy different user instructions for DEP. We're removing the old MDM profile. We're again promoting the user to admin if necessary. And then we're running the command profiles renew -type enrollment. And then we wait for the user to install that profile. And then we demote them back to admin if they were someone that was standard to begin with. So we basically kind of set a key during this script saying, hey, we need to demote them back to standard, which I also forgot to mention here. This also will demote them back to standard. Once that's done, all three of these workflows are going to do the same thing, where they're going to wait for a package receipt to install. Why are we doing that? Well, it's because if something's enrolled in Jamf already through like a quick add package, and then we install the MDM profile, Jamf treats that as if it has to re-enroll the device again. So it goes back through those enrollment steps. There's a period of time that if we try to run other policies after that, they're going to fail because it's not going to have like the correct grouping and stuff like that inside of Jamf. So instead what we do is we have a while loop that continually tries to run this package receipt. And until that file is in place, it's not going to move on to the rest of the process. What do we do next? Well, now we go through whatever post steps we want to do. In this example, we're going to reissue the file vault recovery key, but only if it's broken. If it's not broken, we're just going to go straight to the next step. If it is broken, we'll go through the script to reissue the file vault recovery key. And then we're going to ask, is Jamf Connect installed? If it is, then we're done with the workflow. But if it's not, we're going to install Jamf Connect, launch Jamf Connect, and then wait for the user to log in before we tell them it's complete, because we want the user to log in that first time. At that point, the migration workflow is complete. So let's move on to look at what this workflow looks like in practice. So I'm going to show you three different scenarios: the non-DEP workflow, the DEP workflow, and then the workflow for if the computer is already enrolled in Jamf, so it doesn't have to actually do any MDM migration. So for this non-DEP workflow, we're going to start off with a window that pops up, dep notify window, that asks the user to continue. Whenever they're ready, they click continue, and then it's going to launch some user instructions which tells them what they need to do. So step 1, download the profile. Step 2, install the profile. It's the only two things they need to do because we're going to be doing everything else in between. Once this video has had a chance to run, it launches the web browser for them that goes straight to this MDM profile. They don't even need to log in. Once it downloads it, it's going to search the home folder for the file, launch that file, and then launch system preferences. So all they need to do is click install. They didn't need to go through that process of opening system preferences to the profiles area. Now it's waiting for them to actually install that profile, so the script's not moving forward yet. And then once it sees that it's installed it, it now closes that profiles window. So now that's not distracting them throughout the rest of this process. Then it's going to run the reissue file vault recovery key workflow. Once it's done with that workflow, then it's going to move on to the next step. So it then checks to see if Jamf Connect is installed, and then if it's not, it's going to install Jamf Connect and launch the application. And then they're going to log in with their identity provider credentials. And once they've logged in, then it will move on to the next step. So again, it's waiting for the user to do this process. And then Jamf Connect will prompt them to sync their passwords. And then it will tell them then the enrollment process is complete. And now they're done with this workflow. So the DEP workflow is a little bit different, so I wanted to show that as well. I had to record this with my phone because if you do screen recording through this process, you're not going to see the pop-ups. Weird thing about that. But so same thing as before, it asks them to continue, then it goes on to show them the instructions of what they need to do. And then the thing that's happening in the upper right is it's popping up the device enrollment window. Once they click on that, they have to click allow, and then they enter their password in order to enroll this. It's still waiting in the back end to see if they've installed it. And then once they have installed that MDM profile, it closes system preferences for them. So now they can go back to the migration window. It's also waiting to make sure, and then I'll stop this for a second. So I just didn't show the other steps, but it'll also go through the Jamf Connect and the reissue file vault recovery key workflow. The last one I'm going to show here is the manual Jamf enrollment. So let's say someone just goes to a web browser and enrolls their computer. We want to make sure that it goes through the later steps, but not the earlier steps where it does the MDM migration. So I'm not showing the actual enrollment, just the steps that happen afterwards. User goes ahead and clicks continue, and you see it skips all those MDM migration steps and goes straight to reissuing the file vault recovery key. In this scenario, it wasn't even file vault encrypted, so it didn't even have them do that. It just went straight to logging into Jamf Connect to make sure their passwords were synced. So that's kind of what this workflow looks like in the front end. There's a couple different scenarios I didn't really go through because there's a lot of different things that could happen during this process. But this kind of ensures that no matter what macOS version they're on, no matter how things are set up in the back end, whether they're enrolled in the old MDM or not, everything's going to work and it's going to be a very easy process for the users. Now, I don't necessarily have a script I can give you. It's not at that point yet. As you can probably imagine, this is a very complex script, over probably 1,000 lines of bash scripting. But I did want to give a teaser for what me and Chad are going to be presenting on for JNUC, which is going to have this workflow in place. And it's called the Jamf Toolkit. So the Jamf Toolkit is going to be a repository of a lot of amazing workflows that we've put together and our engineers have put together here. And it's going to have this MDM migration workflow listed here. So these will be a bunch of different scripts and tools that you can download and implement with great user instructions and updated to the latest macOS versions. So join us at San Diego, either in person or virtually for that presentation. It's going to be a lot of fun. You're going to see some really cool stuff. And with that, thank you for watching. In the wise words of Eric Pye, if you liked what we were doing, please send us a like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. Thank you.